Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Module 10 lecture. In this lecture, we will cover self-confidence. And when we talk about self-confidence, it's important to remember that not only are we going to define self-confidence, but we are also going to discuss the benefits of self-confidence, the different levels associated with self-confidence in sport and exercise. We're also going to dive into the differences, or I should say, the relationship between self-confidence and performance. We're going to learn that similar to arousal levels, we know that we want our athletes to have confidence, but not be overly confident to the point that they are impeding their performance. We'll quickly discuss how confidence comes from expectations and those expectations that are set forth by not only the athletes themselves, but also the coaches. And we'll also round out our conversation today with topics such as self-efficacy and modeling, which is essentially how athletes are learning through the lens of others, whether it's through other players or other coaches as well. So let's dive in. Self-confidence, simply put, is the belief that you can successfully perform a desired behavior. Self-confidence, and we've talked a lot about different traits and states throughout the semester. Self-confidence was originally viewed as a disposition, which a disposition is associated with personality, think traits, and also as a state, obviously states in which a scenario that someone is put into. However, more recent research coming from sports psychologists really start to define self-confidence as a social cognitive construct that is really more trait-like, more state-like, depending on what needs to be asked. So in other words, it's been difficult, especially with recent findings and research, to put self-confidence in one box. Think about the different theories, the different approaches that we've discussed. A lot of them have been, or some examples of them have been, of course, trait-based, which is based into personality characteristics, or state-based. And of course, depending on the different approaches, the views that we've discussed, we know that you can look at things through a different lens depending what you are trying to, or through which approach you're trying to look at a certain thing through. But here with self-confidence, we're seeing that it's really hard to put self-confidence as either just a trait or just a state. And it really just depends on what's going on and what the athletes need to do in order to, use that confidence to help them succeed. A couple other things to note about self-confidence. Self-confidence, again, comes from two parts: trait self-confidence and state self-confidence. And if we're looking for more of a definition sense, we define trait confidence as a degree of certainty individuals usually have about their ability. Again, that's closer tied into the characteristics of an athlete, versus, as you would expect, state self-confidence is a belief of certainty that individuals have at a particular moment about their ability to succeed. You see this a lot in sports when athletes perhaps compare themselves to different levels of competition. Perhaps they're playing teams that maybe aren't that good. So naturally, maybe they're more confident, or teams that they perceive as not being that good. So maybe they believe that depending on what team they play, depending on what particular moment they're in terms of what competition they're facing, their level of self-confidence may change. That's state self-confidence. Now, if someone's confident regardless of whoever they verse, regardless of the situation, but instead they're confident within their own ability, that's more associated with trait self-confidence. So again, when we look at self-confidence, there's both elements of trait and there's both elements of state. Something that's important to note that's associated with confidence are different types of fulfilling prophecies. And I'm sure some of you might have heard these already. We have something known as a self-fulfilling prophecy, a negative self-fulfilling prophecy, where, if you believe it will happen, it's probably more likely to happen, versus a negative self-fulfilling prophecy, a barrier that you place upon yourself when you don't think something's going to happen. And we see this a lot with thought stoppage and positive affirmations, where, of course, we know that there's much more than just thinking something's going to happen to make it happen, but there is something to be said when it ties to confidence in terms of people that believe they're going to do something, believe they're going to win, are naturally more confident both at the trait level and the state level than those that do not believe they're going to win. I think that's something that's pretty easy to wrap our heads around. Adding another layer to the definition of self-confidence, we have something known as robust sport confidence. So this is a specific version of self-confidence that we use or that we talk about in sports specifically. And we define this based on a good definition from Thomas Lane and Kingston as a set of enduring yet malleable. And for those that don't know what malleable means, that means that these are beliefs that can be shaped over time, right? They're not set in stone, they're not definite. If something is malleable, you can shape it. A set of enduring yet malleable positive beliefs that protect against the ongoing psychological and environmental challenges associated with competitive sport. So based on this definition, we know that robust sports confidence is a good thing. It's something that we want athletes to have. We want athletes to build upon over time. Within robust sport self-confidence, which again is a version of self-confidence, we know there are multiple sets of beliefs that include multiple types of sports confidence that are intense and stable over time. Because remember, if we look at self-confidence as being something that comes from traits and state situations, we know that that can change. People's levels of self-confidence can change over time against different competitions, against different environments. So to have thoughts, to have a belief in yourself that's enduring but can change depending on the circumstance is really important in sport. And I think it's something that we really want our athletes to be able to comfortably have as they compete, particularly at the highest levels. A couple characteristics that you would expect to be associated with robust self-confidence include multidimensional self-confidence. So what that means is that confidence that someone has within themselves or even among different states that can transfer over time as it goes in through different parts of their athletic identity, their athletic activities, meaning that someone can remain self-confident within practice, across games, across time, during wins, during losses, during situations which they've never encountered, through different dimensions of what they are experiencing. Again, we see that word malleable. Someone can change how they feel about themselves over time as they need to. Someone is durable. Someone has durable self-confidence. That means that even when times are tough, even when they lose, even when things seem bleak, they continue to be persistent in their self-confidence, develop. This typically is associated, this characteristics, with not getting too high, right? Not getting too much of an ego so that you have over self-confidence. And again, you're not performing at a high level. And we're going to see this very shortly. And I alluded to this at the beginning of the presentation where self-confidence follows a very similar pattern to arousal, where we want our athletes to stay at an optimal level, somewhere in the middle of self-confidence, not get too low, not get too high, because getting too high is just as bad as getting too low. And then we start seeing impediments to performance. Protective, someone needs to be able to tune out the noise, whether it's, people that are hating on them on their own team. Maybe coaches are making remarks that are not all that nice or constructive. And obviously, when we start climbing up the levels of professional play, think about the media and how much that impacts athletes. So, people need to understand, or athletes need to understand, that once they build their self-confidence, they need to protect that, but particularly for those that are doing things, whether intentional or not, to try to break that self-confidence. And then, kind of going back to what we said earlier, a strong set of beliefs where what they believe to be true, they hold steadfast in that manner. So what they believe to be about them true about themselves, what they believe to be true about the different states in which they compete in. Again, those different components of self-confidence, both at the trait level and at the state level, they remain consistent. They don't have, varying thoughts about what they believe. To no surprise, there are a lot of benefits of self-confidence. Again, especially being right in that middle pack, not being too high, not being too low. You can expect to see some of these things as someone builds self-confidence and it is in that level of self-confidence that they need to be. These things include positive emotions, heightened concentration, heightened ability to achieve and set goals, increase in effort, better strategies or better implementation of strategies, to be able to focus more on strategies, psychological momentum. We hear the word, and this isn't exactly the same, but we hear the word momentum used a lot in sports when one team has momentum, another team has momentum. And there is some truth that as a team starts getting more confident, if you are on the other side of the team of that competition, I should say, it takes a lot in yourself or a lot in those athletes to continue to maintain their self-confidence, particularly in that state, to be able to overcome the psychological momentum that may be facing. And of course, performance, and which we're going to get into right now, performance and self-confidence have a very interesting and important relationship. So before, and I have a great chart that I want to show you next, but before we get into that, I just want to reiterate are different levels of confidence. And again, I know I keep tying it back to arousal because it's really similar in that we don't want our athletes to get too high. We don't want them to get too low. So we want our athletes to sit in that optimal confidence level, because what this optimal confidence level is telling athletes that yes, they can be confident, whether it's inherently in themselves through a trait confidence or it's a state confidence based on a particular game or particular competition mode, but they're confident because they put the work in, because they know that they've worked hard, they've done everything they can to prepare themselves as best as possible. That's how that confidence stays maintained. When someone starts to lack confidence, they don't have enough confidence, whether again it's trait-based or state-based, they create self-doubt within themselves. This leads to increased arousal, and not in a good way. Anxiety, concentration falls, indecisiveness occurs. So people start to second guess themselves. And on the flip side, when someone is less prepared, but overly confident, they really, miss out on optimal performance. So this is when you start to see in sport things like upset happens, or teams underestimate other teams, or you get teams that were playing really well and they just lay an egg and they perform really poorly for a game or a couple games. That's that overconfidence. So it's a challenge to keep. You think about all the different sports and all the different championship runs. Particularly, you think about teams that maybe have been really successful for a long time. One of the teams that comes to mind when I think of success, I think of the women's collegiate team for basketball at UConn. Right? That team has been very successful for a very long period of time. And I promise you that one of the reasons they've been able to maintain that level of success for the most part is because they stay in that optimal confidence level. One of the hardest things to do, and this holds true in really any sport, is to repeat as a champion, let alone three-peat, or let alone win more than 3 championships in a row. And you don't have to just apply that to the professional level. You can think about high school and all the other levels in between, before and after, because you need to maintain that self-confidence. You need to continue working hard, but not be overly confident, right? Not have a lack of preparedness going into the next season, and also not have self-doubt when things are going wrong. And it's sometimes, with success, it may become harder to stay within that important middle ground. So very simply, as you would expect, and this is the chart that I was alluding to, we want to be right in the middle. We want to have a moderate amount of performance. And if you look here on our chart, very easily, we can see that this is where we want to be, right? In this just right section. That is where we want to be. Because if we get underconfident, our performance is low. And if we get overconfident, our performance goes back to being low because we are underprepared. When you look at that chart, and this is the shape of a chart, is a very common shape for a lot of reasons. But we refer to that chart that I just showed, that table, I should say, as a skewed inverted U confidence performance relationship. And again, all that means is that the U shape of the graph is flipped, hence the name inverted. And, as one goes up, the other goes up to a certain point, but then at that point, once it reaches, as the other one goes down, as one goes down, the other one goes down too. This comes up, this is similar to when you talk about the bell curve and normalization of statistics and that kind of thing. Something goes up, the other thing goes up, up to a certain point, and the same thing obviously true going down on the back end. But the key thing to get here is not being overly confident, not being underly confident, having a healthy level of self-confidence. And that looks different based on the circumstance. It's hard to say to any athlete, you need to have X amount of self-confidence. Think about all the other areas we've talked about up until this point that make up athletes, their personality, and their team camaraderie. Naturally, you're going to have different players on a team that have different levels of self-confidence, and that's okay. But I think ultimately what does need to happen is the team needs to be able to balance itself out. Maybe some players are overly confident, others are underly confident. There needs to be some sort of balance. Or you strive as a coach and as a formal leader, maybe a team captain, to get all your players as best as possible into that optimal, that middle ground level of self-confidence. So how can athletes build self-confidence? Well, think back to when we talked about imagery. One of the most positive things that athletes could do when using imagery is think back to, and again, remember, imagery was creating that experience in their mind using as many senses as possible. They would think back to positive accomplishments that they've had, right? Times they've played well, times they've been successful. Well, similarly here, we see that with self-confidence. When athletes think about the things they've done and the things they can continue to do, especially if they performed under pressure, if they won championships before, if they won at different levels of competition, if they have gotten stronger than they were, anything that shows improvements. That's why when you think about football, a big part of football, particularly for the new athletes that are coming in, that are getting drafted, into the NFL from college, there are people who work with athletes to continue to help them remain confident, particularly if they won national championships, but at the same time understand that they are rookies and they have a lot to learn. And we see this play out, obviously. We know sometimes, you have certain athletes that are kind of, pretty humble. As a matter of fact, they always credit the team. And those players can go on to be very well or do very well at the professional league, or maybe not so well. And the same thing can be true for the players in college that maybe are coming in with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They're a little cocky at times. Obviously, they can be very successful or not successful as well, particularly, considering that football is a big team sport. So all I'm trying to say here is that the closer you can get to that optimal level, whether you need to focus on things you've done really well in the past or kind of take yourself down a peg when you've been successful for a period of time, that's what you need to do. You need to be in that state of mind for as long as possible, knowing that there are going to be fluctuations, or there are going to be times where you feel overly confident, there are going to be times where you don't lack, or you lack some confidence, but you want to be right in that middle ground. Again, try to keep the athletes in that middle ground. Some other things that can happen or that can be done with athletes, or athletes can be encouraged to do to build their self-confidence. They can continue to act confidently. Particularly, we look at these recommendations. These are more based on what coaches can do to help. So obviously, if others are confident within athletes, that can help them tremendously. Constantly reinforcing the things athletes are doing well, whether or not the performance leads to a win, that could be a great place to start. And again, that goes back to a lot of the coaching things that we've talked about, particularly as it related to the chapters on team dynamics, cohesion, leadership, and communication. Athletes should focus on remaining confident. Again, it's one thing for coaches to point out what they did well, regardless of the performance of or the outcome of a performance. It's another thing for the athletes to continue to hold that self-confidence, again, even in the face of adversity. And then lastly, going back to positive affirmations, remember we mentioned earlier in this presentation, both the self-fulfilling prophecy and then the negative self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, positive thinking is powerful, and focusing on good performances, not only the bad ones, and not judging yourself. This is commonly seen as athletes that are hopefully not too hard on themselves, because again, athletes that are very hard on themselves do take a hit tremendously at their to their own self-confidence. But the same can be true for athletes that are not, holding themselves accountable, because they can be overly confident as they continue to move forward. So going along the lines of what we talked about, we have some comments here from Dr. Robin Veely that's going to discuss, or she's going to discuss, some important highlights of self-confidence. Let's watch this short video here.
As most athletes know, and most coaches know, in terms of building confidence. And, my father always used to say, there's no shortcuts anywhere worth going. So I always start with coaches and athletes with physical training. I mean, people want, what I find is lots of times that athletes, they want to be confident, but they want to take a shortcut to get there. There is no shortcuts in terms of all the physical preparation you have to do, and then also the mental preparation. So the first thing I think coaches can do is to train athletes very effectively, setting up simulation drills, etc. So they have to perform under pressure. They have to perform in different types of situations. So as many different situations as they can, so that they can reproduce what they're going to find in competition. So that would be the first thing. The other part for me would be, the mental types of things that you do, and in terms of mental preparation. And, I feel like when I work with athletes, when I talk to coaches about confidence, one thing that I have noticed a lot, and that athletes tell me a lot, is when coaches tell them, I need you to be confident, then sometimes that makes athletes feel less confident. And so one thing I work with coaches on then is kind of a back door to confidence, because like if I'm getting ready to perform and all of a sudden I feel myself not being confident, sometimes I might panic. So instead of focusing on, oh my gosh, I don't feel very confident right now, what's your job right now? What do you need to do right now? And so I think teaching athletes, what do you need to focus on for this free throw or volleyball serve or golf shot or tennis return? Like, stay in the present. What do I need to do right now? And when you have those feelings of confidence, instead of thinking, oh, how do I make myself confident? Go to focus. I think focus, at the moment of performance, I think athletes need to do two things. They need to be able to focus, and they need to be able to manage their energy. And it's too late almost then to say, oh, how can I be more confident? So it's almost, that's the mental part. Now, obviously, coaches are important in terms of saying, hey, Dan, you're ready today, buddy. You're ready for today, you're trained. So the comments I make to you, letting you know that you're prepared, you're ready, is important. I think the other thing coaches can do is focus on process. And that gets into also the questions that you're asking, not are you going to win today, or focusing on outcome, but reminding them of their preparation, or asking them about the process. And what's your job today? Okay, what's the focus that you're going to have? And that way, because confidence really comes from doing it, performing well. And it's hard to just manufacture that. But I think coaches can get athletes thinking in the right way to start them on that positive performance cycle, and then the confidence kind of comes.
Great points there. And if you ever been in an argument with anyone, and I'm sure you've heard this, you might be laughing when I say this, but say you have a fight with your significant other, and you tell them, calm down, calm down. I'm sure you've heard that's probably the worst thing you can do, because what it does is it forces them not to calm down and to do the exact opposite of calming down. So when Dr. Robin Veely, who we just heard, she mentioned the fact that she tells coaches to not necessarily tell their athletes, obviously when the coaches want their athletes to be more confident, but she said that she tells the coaches to not, or tells the coaches to not tell their athletes to be confident. Like, hey, I need you to be more confident, because I think what that does, it makes the athletes feel as if, or think, well, does that mean I'm not confident enough right now to get the job done? And in the middle of a performance, that is not what you want to see, right? You don't want to see those doubts creep in. Because again, that brings, when you think back to that inverted U chart, that brings the athlete back down to that lower left section of the chart. So I thought that was really interesting to think about. And then the second part that I'll quickly bring up is Dr. Robin Veling said, for optimal performance, she believes athletes should be able to focus and control their energy. And again, that's the theme that we've seen, I think, throughout the entire semester, throughout many of the chapters, many of the module lectures, which hopefully you've listened to all of them. You don't want to get too high, you don't want to get too low, whether it's arousal, whether it's, stress, obviously it's tied into levels of arousal. But here today, confidence, optimal level of confidence, right in the middle ground, not too high, not too low, because if you're in the middle ground, you've prepared. And we know if confidence comes from primarily being able to do things that you've done or having done them already in the past with some level of success, that's why I focus on the things that you've done well, and on the moments you've performed really well is really important in building that self-confidence, again, maintaining that that middle ground where, so, think about this. Preparation keeps you from getting too high with self-confidence, and remembering your success, however you define that, however that was in your life, or you're obviously talking about the athletes through their lives, their sport lives, that keeps them from getting too low. And again, a combination of both is what helps maintain you in that middle ground. When athletes and coaches start to develop or start to form expectations of confidence, or I should say when they form, what confidence they want to have within themselves, or in other words, athletes, or I should say coaches, when they start to think about the kinds of athletes they have and how confident they are in certain athletes, these things come from expectations. And when we talk about expectations, whether these are expectations are coming from the coaches or the athletes themselves, we think about different stages in which these expectations are formed. So I'm just going to quickly go through these stages, but again, just remember, these are ways in which coaches develop expectations about their athletes, the process through which they think these expectations through. And of course, it's no surprise that the expectations that coaches set for their athletes, these can have a tremendous impact on the confidence that athletes have within themselves, meaning that if the expectations are too high, they're unrealistic expectations, unfair expectations, and the athletes do not reach those expectations that have been set for them, you can expect them to many times fall within that lower self-confidence area. But if the expectations are too low, not high enough, then the truth can be said about athletes falling into the overconfidence section, about athletes falling in there. So early on, no surprise, coaches were forming expectation based on things such as gender, race, body size, performance information. Think about all the combine testing that occurs. What happens as a result of combine performances? Expectations are built, and based on those expectations, you think about college athletes going into professional team sports. People are put into draft classes, right? People are put into different rounds, into different picks, all based on expectations. But again, we see that disconnect with expectations and self-confidence when perhaps expectations are too high, too low, and that starts to impact where that athlete falls within that inverted U of the confidence performance relationship. Coaches may change their, or I should say, they might change their behaviors based on their expectations. So they might try to force their expectations on particular athletes. Think about someone that gets a high draft pick. If that high draft pick, is the number one draft pick, and that draft pick is expected to, change the course of a franchise, you know that the coach is going to treat that athlete a little bit different than someone else that maybe was as much of a high draft pick. And sometimes it's not intentional, but sometimes it is. And I think it's important to note that expectations do change behavior, particularly on the coaching side. These behaviors that occur, that change when coaches start treating these players with higher or even lower expectations differently, this leads to actual performance changes, right? Can cause, you think about if a coach is giving less attention to a player that has less expectations, at least set forth by the coach himself or herself, of course, there's going to be a hit to performance and then a hit to self-confidence. You can't, there's no way around that. And then ultimately, we start to see in this last stage whether or not the athletes actually confirm the expectations. And if the expectations are not met, or even if they are met, coaches go back to the drawing board, they look at the athletes again based on what happened, and then they either set higher expectations or they realize that the expectations they set in the beginning were too high. And hopefully they adjust accordingly and they continue to do what they can to help the athlete and stay in that middle ground of self-confidence and ideally stay in that middle ground in order to keep ideal performance. Okay, two last bits and pieces here in this presentation. We have something known as self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is the perception of one's ability to perform a task successfully. Very similar to self-confidence, similar but not exactly the same. I would say the biggest difference between self-efficacy and self-confidence is that with self-confidence, we could break it down into trait self-confidence or state confidence. And it's really just, how well you can, or how much you trust yourself to do certain things versus how much you believe in your own ability, which is more self-efficacy. It is a situation-specific form of self-confidence. So self-efficacy is essentially a type of self-confidence that comes from or arises based on a situation-specific scenario. So if you think about a tree, just kind of like a thought tree for a second, and at the top of the tree, you put self-confidence, and then you broke down that tree into, on one side, you had trait self-confidence. On the other side of the tree, you had state confidence. And then we follow down that tree. And on the right side of the tree, we're still looking at state self-confidence. We could see within that side, we have self-efficacy, which again, situation-specific, state-specific form of self-confidence. Couple specific types of self-efficacy. Again, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. We have something known as self-regulatory efficacy, learning efficacy, decision-making efficacy, coping efficacy. I don't have to read those to you. I think you can make sense of those. Just be familiar with those general definitions. And the last two here, so we have really six in total, more so five specific ones, and then one general category. Our fifth one, self-presentational efficacy, and our general category, other efficacies, which include individuals' beliefs in the abilities of others. So traveling, that efficacy becoming something in that general category, something that, again, is expressed in the form of how confident are you not only in yourself, but also in the people that help you succeed. It's no surprise that coaches also need to be aware of their own efficacy. So in other words, they need to be aware of how far they believe they can reach their athletes, whether it's both on the psychological side or on the physical side. They need to be aware of their own limits and capacities. And typically they develop this understanding, or you hope that they develop this understanding by understanding what game strategies they use, what motivation they rely on, what are their techniques that they go to, and how much they implement character building into their daily routines. And I think when we talked earlier about coaching in, obviously team dynamics, leadership, and communication in that module lecture, we saw that The coaches that were the most successful were the ones that not only cared about the athletes as athletes, but also cared as the athletes as individual people and cared about their daily lives and the stressors that they went through on a regular basis. That goes into character building. So, you know right off the bat that the coaches that do have that uh, care for the individual person, for the individual athlete, and not just what you can do for me on the field or on the court, those are going to be the ones that are more effective or have more efficacy in their ability to coach. So it's no surprise, coaches need to improve or can always need to work on their own commitment to their staff, to their players. They need to encourage good communication from them to the athletes, from them to other coaches, among the athletes themselves. They need to encourage appropriate concentration, control, confidence. No surprises with any of those concepts. Okay, and the last thing we'll talk about today is modeling. Modeling is also called observational learning. So one of the more common ways for athletes to learn what they learn about a sport, either whether it's on, off the field, on, off the court, is through modeling. Again, they essentially are looking to coaches, to other players, especially when they haven't done things before, to understand not only technical skills, but also how confident they should be in certain situations, how they should try to perform in certain situations. Because if you think back to the video we saw in this lecture with Dr. Robin Veely, she said that confidence really only occurs, you can only really build confidence when you've done something before successfully. Now, if you've never done something before, can you still be confident? Yes, of course. You might not have as much self-confidence as someone who has, but you can build confidence by learning things through modeling, right? By learning through others, through the performances of others. You think it's like, oh, my teammate did this, and they've done this in the game, and I've competed against them in practice, so maybe I can do that too. Or a coach has done this before, and he's worked with me extensively on the skill, so I can do that too. And there's a couple of factors. I won't get into them too much. I know your text mentions them a little bit more in detail, but there are different aspects of modeling. But we're going to talk more about modeling, particularly when we get into some of the later module lectures in the semester. One thing I will bring up about modeling is we have something here known as the 4 states modeling process. This is just the way through which athletes are learning through either other athletes or coaches. We follow the process of attention, retention, motor reproduction, and motivation. And I think ultimately, when someone gets to the point where they're intrinsically motivated, and there's that word again, right? Intrinsic motivation. We talked about how important that is. When someone is intrinsically motivated to model someone else, then the process becomes much more fluid, and then much more learning takes place. And then they're able to really take from that confidence growth, even if it's a skill that they've never done before. That's it. All right, so hopefully that made some good sense for you. Again, that was our module lecture on self-confidence. We will pick it up soon with our next module lecture. Thank you.